Welcome. I'm Lonnie Berger. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Poverty, and on behalf of the Economics Department and IRP, I want to welcome you to our 20th annual Robert J. Lampman Memorial Lecture. So unfortunately, the Lampman family can't be with us this year, but they were absolutely thrilled by our choice of Bruce Western as this year's speaker, and they are with us in spirit. And they, when in years they're not here, they always watch the video and send comments. As always, we are grateful for their ongoing support, not only of IRP in this lecture series, but of the university in general. So before introducing Bruce, I want to say a few words about Bob Lampman. So he was a professor of economics here for more than 30 years, and he was the founder and guiding spirit of IRP. His research really spanned the gamut of social welfare policies and programs and issues related to poverty. And he was, by all accounts, an exceptional and unique scholar, teacher, mentor, and individual. And so actually, one of the things Bruce and I were chatting about when I first came in was that he was known for, when evaluating public programs or public policies or considering policy and program options, asking the simple question, what does it do for the poor? And Bruce was saying, we should be asking that question about all our criminal justice policies. So in 1964, Bob authored the chapter on poverty for President Johnson's economic report, and that chapter really served as the administration's roadmap for their war on poverty, and really established him as the intellectual architect for the U.S. war on poverty. During his time in the Johnson administration, he also worked with the federal government and pushed to establish a national research center that was dedicated to studying the nature, causes, and consequences of poverty, and the cures for poverty and inequality. And as a result, in March of 1966, the University of Wisconsin got the contract to establish IRP. So we are now 53 years strong and continuing our commitment to Bob's vision of creating better anti-poverty policy that's informed by rigorous research. So after Bob's death in 1997, his family worked with IRP in the economics department to establish this lecture. And the idea is to feature eminent poverty and social policy scholars whose work addresses the topics to which Bob devoted his career. So today's speaker, Bruce Western, is among the very top scholars in the world focusing on the U.S. criminal justice system, including its causes, scope, and consequences, and really of what the historic growth in incarceration in the U.S. has meant and will continue to mean. And in particular, he looks at the intersection of poverty, inequality, and criminal justice involvement. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are pretty familiar with his work. He's the Bryce Professor of Sociology and Social Justice and co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was vice chair of the National Academy of Sciences panel on the causes and consequences of high incarceration rates in the U.S. And he's also been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Russell Sage Foundation visiting scholar, and a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study. His research contributions span a pretty impressive range of policy-relevant topics. So beyond criminal justice, he studies poverty, social and economic inequality, and labor markets. He's done work on employment and wage discrimination and the decline of unions. He's also made really important statistical methodological contributions. So his current projects include a randomized experiment assessing the effects of criminal justice fines and fees on misdemeanor defendants, and a field study of solitary confinement in state prisons. He's also the principal investigator of the Square One project that aims to reimagine public policy responses to violence under conditions of poverty and racial inequality. I'm guessing many of you know his 2018 book, Homeward, The Life in the Year After Prison. This was really just a revolutionary examination of the complexity of prisoner reentry and the role of public policy therein. And I have no doubt he'll draw somewhat heavily from this book in his talk today. So I'm thrilled that he's able to join us today and to talk about his work on poverty, criminal justice, and social justice. I just want to say, after the lecture, please join us for a reception right around the corner to the right. We're a poverty center. We like the food to get eaten and not wasted. And I lastly want to thank Dana Connolly, who is our event planner extraordinaire, who did this and all our events and always does a great job. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bruce.
It's Thank you very much, Lonnie, for a very kind introduction and for the invitation to come here and speak to you all today. And thanks so much to Dana for all the work that she's done in helping to organise my visit as well. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here at IRP for the 2019 Robert Lampman Memorial Lecture. And today I want to talk about what has come to be called the problem of mass incarceration. Now, this lecture is named for the great Wisconsin poverty researcher Bob Lampman. Lampman's great skill, as I know it, extended from the technical details of socioeconomic measurement and the measurement of poverty specifically, to the pragmatic details of policy making in the sausage machine of government agencies. Lampman recognised that research had an essential role in improving life in disadvantaged communities, and poverty was much more than just an income concept. It described how the most disadvantaged could be excluded from full participation in social and economic life more broadly. The problem of mass incarceration bears a strong resemblance to the problem of poverty. At one level, mass incarceration is the byproduct of a vast deficit of public investment, particularly in poor communities of colour. In these communities, people are not just short of money. Instead, all sorts of disadvantages, poor health, lack of schooling, public safety, all of these disadvantages cluster together. And this is the landscape on which the public policy of whole-scale criminal punishment has grown. In trying to pull apart this catastrophe in public policy that is mass incarceration, I've focused at different times in my research on different kinds of empirical realities, relying sometimes on demographic analysis, at other times on field research, and I guess lately on a type of ethical narrative, I would call it. And this has been my effort, I suppose, to emulate what Robert Lampman did so brilliantly, trying to use research in a pragmatic, problem-solving way to shine light on social conditions of extreme deprivation with the goal of transforming them. So my basic argument to you today is that mass incarceration is intimately connected to the very harsh conditions of American poverty, and meaningful criminal justice reform will need to account for this reality, both in its policy specifics and in its underlying values. So let me try and explain all this. And then, this talk is going to be sort of a play in 3 acts. And Act 1 is intended to set the scene by providing a little bit of empirical context that can explain how we got to where we are today. So let me begin in a very general way. We measure the incarceration rate. We measure the scale of the penal system in a country with the incarceration rate. That's the number of people who are locked up on a given day per 100,000 of the population. So what's the fraction of the population who are incarcerated on any given day? And of course, in Western European countries, incarceration rates are about 100 per 100,000, about 0.1 of 1%. But in the United States, the incarceration rate is nearly an order of magnitude larger. It's about 700 per 100,000. Now, we can think about how unusual the scale of American punishment is, also in historical perspective. We got good data, goes back to the mid-1920s. And if we look at imprisonment rates over most of the 20th century, 1925 to the early 1970s, the rate of imprisonment was historically about what it is in Western Europe today. It's about 100 per 100,000. But in the early 1970s, something changed and the system began to grow. And it grew every year for the next 35 years. Now, it's ticked down a little bit over the last 10 years, but we're still sitting atop of this plateau in which the scale of criminal punishment in the United States is 5 times higher than its historic average. What does this mean in terms of numbers? Well, at the very deep end of the system, state or federal prison, people who have been convicted of felonies, they're serving at a minimum 12 months, about 28 months of time served at the median. 1.6 million people in state or federal prison. 28 months of time served at the median. Some, of course, are serving very much longer than that. There are about 50,000 people in the United States who are serving so-called life without parole sentences. There's no prospect of release for those serving life without parole sentences. By comparison to Western Europe, there are about 50 people serving life without parole sentences, so-called natural life sentences in Western Europe, 50,000 in the United States. So not only are we locking up many more people on any given day, incarceration rates are so high in part because people in the United States are incarcerated for much longer. Now, this is not the entire incarcerated population because there's another 750,000 people in local jails. So these are people who are awaiting trial or they've been sentenced and they're serving short sentences, less than a year. So about 2.2 million people altogether who are incarcerated on any given day in the United States. Now, this is not the entire correctional population because there's about another 850,000 people who are on parole. So these are people who have been incarcerated and they've been released now and they're meeting in a regular way with a parole officer out in the community. That's not the entire community corrections population because there's another 4 million people who are on probation. And these are people who, in most cases, have been given so-called suspended sentences, non-custodial sentences, and they're meeting with a probation officer out in the community. You add it all up, it's 7 million people in the United States and now under some sort of correctional supervision, and this is historically new. These very, very high rates of correctional supervision have only emerged in the last 10 or 15 years. Striking as these numbers are, this is not the most important thing about incarceration in America. The most important thing about incarceration in America is its unequal distribution across the population. So everything I've shown you so far is just a snapshot at a point in time. Each one of those dots in that time series is the fraction of the population on a given day who are locked up. But we could think about people's exposure to incarceration in a different way. We could ask, well, what's the likelihood that someone's ever going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives? Why might we be interested in a statistic like that? Well, we might think that being incarcerated confers a whole array of disadvantages that continue to affect you even after you've been released from incarceration. How large is the group that is at risk of those adverse life chances? So in work with Becky Pettit, we thought about a birth cohort. A birth cohort born 1945 to 49. So this is a group of people who are reaching their mid-30s in 1979. Okay? They're growing up largely before the great explosion in incarceration in America. And we looked at men, black and white men at different levels of schooling. Very large racial disparity in incarceration. African Americans are about 6 to 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Very steep educational gradient in incarceration. Nearly all of the growth in incarceration over the last 35 years was concentrated in the non-college fraction of the population. Among non-college black men, about 12% we estimated, have been to prison at some point in their lives. Non-college black men, that's about half of all black men, the bottom half of the educational distribution for black men. If they never completed high school, we estimated that 15% had been to prison at some point in their lives. We compared this group, this birth cohort born 45 to 49, to another one born 30 years later, 75 to 79. And we asked the same question: what's the likelihood someone's ever been to prison in that birth cohort? So for the 75 to 79 birth cohort, they're reaching their mid-30s in 2009. They're growing up through the period of mass incarceration. Among non-college black men, 36%, we estimate, have been to prison at some point in their lives. This is the very deep end of the system now. 12 months at a minimum, 28 months at the median of time served, and in many cases, very much longer than that. If they dropped out of high school, if they never completed high school, those African American men, 70%, we estimate, have been to prison at some point in their lives. Now, this is happening, right, at a time when crime is historically low. As crime, the homicide rate, for example, is at its lowest level since the early 1960s. So this is all produced by policy change, and it happens within a generation. There's a revolution in criminal justice policy, and imprisonment becomes the presumptive sentence for a felony offence. An entire generation of very disadvantaged black men are incarcerated. So, for me, this is kind of the social fact, the salient social fact that I began to do a lot of research on. What are the consequences of these very, very high rates of incarceration, overwhelmingly concentrated among African American men with very low levels of schooling, overwhelmingly concentrated in very poor communities of colour? What's the effect of all of that? And a whole research industry grew up around this problem of trying to understand the consequences of very high rates of incarceration, particularly on patterns of racial inequality and poverty in America. And so researchers began studying things like labour markets. What's the effect on your employment opportunities and your earnings of going to prison? What's the effects on health? What's the effects on mortality, the well-being of children whose parents are incarcerated? It's a big, complicated research literature. But if I could summarise it, it would be something like this. Mass incarceration criminalised social problems related to racial inequality and poverty on a historically unprecedented scale. Social problems related to racial inequality on poverty. So this includes problems of violent crime. But it is not limited to problems of violent crime. It also includes things like untreated addiction, mental illness, homelessness. All of these social problems also became criminalised, and people at risk of all of those things were also incarcerated at very high rates. So mass incarceration involved the criminalisation of a whole variety of social problems related to racial inequality and poverty. And because the negative effects of incarceration, because of the way in which incarceration reduced economic opportunities and impaired health and increased mortality and undermined the well-being of children, these negative effects were concentrated in communities that were already disadvantaged, and this tended to contribute to the reproduction of poverty, and that means both over the life course and from one generation to the next, and significantly deepened racial racial inequality. So a lot of the work I was doing, I suppose, was very much in this sort of research program. The research was summarised in a National Academy of Sciences consensus panel on the causes and consequences of the growth of incarceration in the United States. Now, NAS consensus panels, the idea of it is you get 20 scholars around a table and you meet for 2 years and you try and summarise all of the scientific research in a field. And a common conclusion after reviewing the libraries full of research that all the scholars are expert in and have laboured in for decades, a common conclusion is, after reviewing all of this research, is that, well, you know, more research is needed. And I got to say, in the NAS panel on incarceration, we were really seized by a great deal of urgency about the problem of incarceration and the corrosive effects that it was having, particularly in communities of colour and particularly poor communities of colour. So our headline recommendation was this. Given the small crime prevention effects of long prison sentences, and I could talk more about that research, and the possibly high financial, social and human costs of incarceration, federal and state policymakers should revise criminal justice policies to significantly reduce the rate of incarceration in the United States. So our headline recommendation is we need to get back into international and historical norms with the extent of our level of incarceration. And there was very, very strong consensus around that conclusion. Now, the work I was doing, which was mostly focused on labour markets and families, trying to understand the effects of incarceration on labour markets and families, I think was very much part of this research program that we were reviewing in the NAS panel. And I got to say, I feel I learned a tremendous amount from that research. But I also, over time, was becoming frustrated with it in many ways. At the same time as I was doing a lot of this work, I was going into prison a lot, and I was teaching in prison. And I was getting to know people who are incarcerated and people who worked in prisons, and I was hearing a lot of their stories about their lives and the pathways that ultimately led to prison. And at the same time, I was analysing these big social survey data sets like the National Longitudinal Survey and the Fragile Family Survey, the Current Population Survey. And I was often reducing this very, very rich experience that I was hearing about in the prison classroom to 4 demographic variables: age, race, sex and schooling. And so I was getting frustrated that the analysis, the statistical analysis I was doing, wasn't matching the reality that I was hearing about from people who are incarcerated. The data I was analysing was not designed, really, to study the effects of incarceration. There wasn't a very detailed picture in the biannual interviews of the NLSY, for example. There wasn't a very detailed picture of what does this process look like when someone's been incarcerated for years and then they're released and they have to return to a community and find their place in that community again. I felt that the data I was analysing, these big national social survey data sets, were not giving me a very granular picture of that social process of the transition from prison to community. And finally, I was worrying a lot about the problem of underenumeration. A lot of people who are incarcerated are men who are often not strongly attached to households. They're often not living with their children and the mothers of their children, or if they are, they're only living with those children and mothers intermittently or in a complex set of family relationships. And as a result, our social survey methods, which are often based on household sampling frames, we tend to underobserve, right? We tend to underobserve those prime age men who are very disadvantaged, who are not strongly attached to households. And this is exactly that group of people who are at greatest risk of incarceration. So I was worried that the people that I was most interested in were not actually being covered very well by the data sources that I was spending all my time analysing. So that's the end of Act 1. That is the mass incarceration story. And the product of this frustration brought me to the Boston Reentry study. I thought, I need to do a reentry study. I need to get much greater proximity to the process of leaving incarceration and returning to a community. So in collaboration with Anthony Braga from Northeastern University and Rihanna Cole at the Massachusetts Department of Correction, we devised the Boston Reentry Study. And the way this happened was Anthony and I were on a bus. We were coming back from MCI Norfolk. It's a medium security prison in Massachusetts, and we were teaching a class together there. And Anthony is a lifelong Bostonian. He had worked closely with the Boston Police Department, and he's a very distinguished criminologist and a student of Boston. And I was saying to him on the bus as we were coming back, saying, you know, I think we got to do a reentry study. And but the problem with a reentry study is attrition. It's really difficult to keep track of people if you're trying to follow them, you know, over a year or so. People coming out of prison, the attrition rates from these studies have been very high. Anthony said, "I know Boston. I reckon I can keep track of everyone." And I said, okay, well, we got to do this now just to see if you're right. And so that's how the study started. This was a small longitudinal interview study, a field study. 122 people coming out of prison in Massachusetts. There was only one criterion for eligibility for the study, and that is you had to be returning to a Boston area address. So that meant that we got men, we got women, we're in pre-release centres and minimum security, we're in maximum security, we were talking to people in solitary confinement who were releasing directly to the street, we were talking to people in non-contact units behind plexiglass who were going to be out in about 5 days' time. We're in the state psychiatric hospitals, which in Massachusetts are run by the Department of Correction. So we got the very broad spectrum of people who are leaving prison. We interviewed them 5 times in the year. Baseline, a week before prison release. 2 weeks later, out in the community, so they'd been out 1 week at that point, and then 2 months later, 6 months later, and 12 months later. I came to this research really as a poverty researcher, so we collected a lot of data on employment, housing, health, family relationships, but we also collected information about drug use, crime, and criminal justice system contact. Yes?
Did the study include juvenile detention?
Only adults. So we were just in the adult prison system. So This was a very, very rich data collection, and we're still analysing data and writing it up. But if I could pull out 3 headline findings, they would be these. Number 1, as we got to know people, they talked to us a lot about the violence that they had seen in their lives. And it was certainly the case that some of the people that we had talked to had perpetrated acts of serious violence, and that was why they were incarcerated. But it was also the case that people had very long life histories of exposure to violence as victims and as witnesses. And often their victimisation, which in many cases was very serious, dated from very early in childhood. By the time we got to our exit interview, we significantly redesigned our survey to include a module that tried to capture particularly the exposure of trauma, the exposure of our respondents to trauma in early childhood. Second finding, people coming out of prison are in poor health. Very high rate of chronic and infectious disease, lots of chronic pain, lots of mental illness, a lot of mood disorders, depression, anxiety, PTSD. In about 15% of our sample, there were diagnoses of serious mental illness, psychotic conditions, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, things like that. Third main finding, there is a very deep level of material hardship in the first year after prison. The median income in our sample in the first year after prison in Boston was $6,000. And as this room well knows, that for an individual living alone, a $6,000 income is about half the federal poverty line. So that's a level of deep poverty at the median in the first year after prison. Let me show you a little bit of data about this. Childhood trauma, what did this look like? About 60% of our sample reported to us that they grew up in a family where a family member was struggling with serious drug problems. About half the sample said that they were beaten by their parents. 40% of our respondents had witnessed a violent death in childhood. 40% had witnessed a violent death. About 40% of the sample, their parents had lost custody of them, and that meant sometimes they were in foster care, sometimes they were in juvenile detention, DYS, as it's called in Massachusetts. High rates of family violence in the respondents' childhood homes, depression, suicidality, and about 20% of the sample reported to us that they had been sexually abused as kids. Poor health, what does that look like? We came to call this human frailty. High rates of substance abuse, high rates of depression, very high rates of chronic pain, back pain, arthritis, a lot of chronic disease, infectious disease, often related to sustained drug use. About 20% of our sample were heroin users. Also reports of diagnoses of anxiety. 15% of the sample had reported to us psychotic diagnosis.
What proportion of the 122 were women, and did these things vary by gender?
They varied a lot by gender. We had only 15 women in the sample. The women almost universally reported a prior mental health diagnosis, so much higher rate of mental illness among the women. Much more serious histories of exposure to trauma and violent victimisation. And for the women, it often extended into adulthood, whereas the victimisation reported to us by the men often dated from childhood, but the victimisation reported by the women was much more enduring. So we're trying to look at the relationship between these two things. A very simple thing to do. You could create a scale. You could just add up how many different kinds of trauma were being reported to us by our respondents. So you could form a scale with all of these measures. Similarly, you could form a scale that captured physical and mental health, and you could just add up all of the self-reported diagnoses of physical and mental health problems. The interesting thing is exposure to trauma in childhood is related to poor health in adulthood. Those exposed to the greatest trauma in childhood were in the worst health in adulthood. If people had reported to us that they were abused in childhood, then their health was even worse in adulthood than we would expect given their level of childhood trauma. Now, you can divide the sample roughly in half. If you take those people with 4 or more physical or mental health problems, and we called that group the frail. These were the people who were struggling most with physical and mental health problems. The material hardship that people experienced after release from prison, in that 12 months after release from prison, was concentrated among the most frail, among those who were struggling most with physical and mental health problems. So here we're just showing different measures of material hardship for the frail and the not frail, people in reasonable physical and mental health and those who reported the most physical and mental health problems. And we're looking at a period 1 week, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months after release from prison over our follow-up period. Nearly all of the hard drug use, that's cocaine and heroin use, was concentrated among people with the most serious health problems. If we look at housing instability, there was virtually no independent housing in our sample in the full year after incarceration. And that meant that people were doubling up with family, or they were in a shelter or a transitional housing program, or they were street homeless. There was very little independent housing, very acute housing instability. If we look at unstable housing, people in shelters, street homelessness, or in some sort of transitional housing program, that experience of housing insecurity was concentrated among those with the most serious health problems. The people with less serious health problems were living in private households. We can look at employment. Employment gradually improved over the year, but jobless rates were highest among people with the most serious health problems. In part, that was because a lot of people had work-limiting disabilities. They couldn't work because of chronic pain, because of mental illness, for example, and we see higher rates of joblessness. So this, I think, is, for me, this felt like a step forward. I was learning more. This was richer data than I was able to analyse, than the kinds of demographic analysis I was initially showing you about rates of incarceration. But it's still a very quantitative analysis, and it is missing a lot of the stories that I was coming to know from the people that we were talking to. So that is the end of Act 2. And Act 3 is about the stories.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
I came late, I don't know if you covered this, but are these individuals still on some kind of correctional supervision?
Some are, some aren't. And so on release, about half of our sample were on community supervision, and about the other half had maxed out. Yeah. So in the book, I'm trying, the book is very qualitative, which felt very experimental for me, but I wanted to tell these stories because I felt there was a different kind of empirical reality in the stories that people were telling us. So let me read to you a very short extract. And this is about one of our older respondents. His name was Peter, an older African-American man. Peter was an older black man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and an elegant bearing. He arrived early for our interview a week after his release. Waiting on the street, he was hesitant to face the crowd inside the diner in Mattapan. We began the interview by asking Peter what the best part about being out was for him. That was our icebreaker question. That was our first community interview when we met with people again just after they were out of prison. We'd ask them, what's the best part about being out? Breathing fresh air, he said. What's the most challenging thing? Being around a bunch of people, just being in public areas. And so we heard a lot of reports about anxiety and anxiety attacks, particularly in crowds in the first months after getting out of prison. Although he got anxious in crowds, Peter began his latest release with a flurry of activity. He came home on a Friday, and that morning he bought clothes and got a haircut. He spent time with his sister that first day and stayed at her house. 5 other people were living in his sister's house, including her fiancé, 1 adult son, 2 younger children. Peter worried that he was a burden on what was already a crowded family home. He could have stayed with his father, but his father drank. His brother also stayed there, and he was dealing drugs. Being at my father's wasn't a healthy situation. My sister's is the safest place for me, he said. Peter spent his first weekend home with his 9-year-old son. They talked, did some shopping, and went to the movies. On his first Monday after getting out, he reported to probation in the morning, then visited his father in the afternoon. On Tuesday, he enrolled in food stamps and then met with his older son later in the day. Then he went to the welfare office again on Wednesday, then visited his younger son's school to introduce himself to the boys' teachers. Thursday was mental health counselling. By the end of his first week out, Peter had spent time with 2 of his 3 children, enrolled in food stamps, obtained a mass transit card, made an appointment for counselling, checked in with several shelters, and visited a career centre. The following week, he would begin his job search. So this is what the transition from prison to community looks like on the ground. And in the book, I argue that the overwhelming reality that faces people who have been to prison has 3 main characteristics: poverty, racial inequality, and violence. And in the policy debates about reentry and criminal justice reform more generally, we're often not very good at talking about any of these things. And we're certainly not very good at talking about them all together. So this is a big challenge for us. For liberal criminal justice reformers, the issue of violence poses a significant challenge. I want to show a video clip of Peter talking about violence and incarceration. So for me, this clip suggests how violence is sustained over a lifetime, and it shows how the prison itself is a source of violence in people's lives. And it raises the question for me whether incarceration on a massive scale could ever have been a successful anti-violence strategy. So if not incarceration, what? I think perhaps the key lesson of the reentry study is saying something deep about the nature of incarceration. We usually think about incarceration as the deprivation of liberty or a loss of autonomy. But the men and women who are leaving prison in Boston were also disconnected in all sorts of ways from the intimate bonds of family and friendship and work and community. I think the fundamental justice challenge involves precisely strengthening the bonds of family and community for victims of violence and offenders alike. Incarceration offers nothing to that challenge. So policies that improve the material well-being of people and empower them will help meet the challenges of poverty and human frailty that underlie mass incarceration. Designing social policy according to these principles, I think, will help relieve the justice system of so much of its unwanted and ill-equipped responsibility for the very, very harsh conditions of American poverty. So public policy in this vision, I think, is serving a more fundamental purpose. Public policy, social policy, in the aftermath of violence and other harms, involves supporting a very human process of transformation. I'm going to show one last clip, and it's Peter again. He's talking about transformation in his own life. In this clip, Peter's telling the story. His son's brother, not his own son, but his son's brother, 14 years old, was sitting at a bus stop in Dorchester in Boston, and he was shot dead. And Peter was driving his son down to New York to get a funeral for his brother's, get a suit for his brother's funeral. And he's talking about that. So for me, this is the great paradox of mass incarceration, right? The system demands heroic feats of personal transformation from people whose agency, whose capacity to intervene in their own lives is often profoundly compromised by trauma and human frailty. And I could talk to you a lot more about reentry policy and what I think we need to do. But at a very human level, at a basic level, I think we need a justice policy that welcomes people and secures a place for those who have been drawn into violence, whether it's the violence of street crime or the state violence of mass incarceration. And this is how a community plays its part in this project of personal transformation. So I'm going to tell one last story. And this is intended to fire our imaginations and suggest to us all of the possibility that might lie in front of us. I was in Addis Ababa a few years ago for a research project that we have studying justice institutions in Ethiopia. And I was at dinner with two Ethiopian researchers, and one of them, Mulugeta, told me about a colleague of his at a German research institute, a German anthropologist. So one day the anthropologist was out in a remote area. He was driving through a small village, and his car tragically struck a small child and killed her. The girl's parents ran outside to see what happened, and a crowd quickly formed around the anthropologist. The parents tended to the child, and the anthropologist asked that the police be called, but he was told that there weren't any police there, that the village dealt with matters like this by itself. The anthropologist was told that he would go, but they were going to send for him in a few days. So he returned to Addis, and later that week a message came for him that he had to return to the village, and he was told that he had to return alone. He went to my friend Mulugeta and he asked what should he do, and Mulugeta said, you have to go back to the village. So he went back to the village, and when he got there he was escorted to a meeting with the elders of the village. And first he was told to pay 2,500 birr, that's about $125, to the family of the dead child. And next he was ordered by the meeting to buy a goat for the family, and he purchased the goat, which was then immediately slaughtered. The father of the dead child was called to the front of the meeting. And the anthropologist, he was already standing at the front of the room, and he was told to hold out his hand. So he held out his hand, and his wrist was bound to the wrist of the child's father with the entrails of the goat. The village elder then announced that the anthropologist was now a member of the dead girl's family. And that was that. He was free to go. The anthropologist returned to Addis. He was very upset. felt that he hadn't properly compensated the family, he hadn't been punished. And Mulugeta said, you have to understand that for the rest of your life, you're now part of that man's family. You have all of the obligations of a family member. You have to visit from time to time, and if they're going through problems that you might help with, you should help them, just as a member of their own family would. So Western ideas about punishment and retribution, they're radically absent in this case of customary justice. But like the Ethiopian story, the problem of prisoner reentry raises the question of when does punishment end? When and how are debts extinguished? These are ethical questions as much as they are empirical questions. And I've tried to maintain this ethical perspective in my research. I think to guide politics or policy, the ethics of punishment have to confront the real stories of people who have been incarcerated. The research that we do, how we design it, it's really important because it shapes what we see and who we hear, right? That's what we bring into the public conversation. What do we see and who do we hear? Very deeply disadvantaged people are often not fully visible to our usual methods of large-scale data collection. We've got to go into the field to get proximity. There's partly a question of research design, but it's got ethical implications. What do we see? Who do we hear? What are we bringing into the public conversation? Observing some of our deepest poverty and the suffering that accompanies it, I think that yields the strongest test of our values. We have to test our values against the real conditions of poverty and racial inequality and violence that surrounds mass incarceration. And if we do that, I hope that we might imagine a better path to justice. So thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions. There are a few folks going around with microphones, so please use the microphones, because if not, we don't get it on the video.
Yeah, it's my understanding that prisons in Massachusetts tend to be quite archaic in as far as physical plant goes. I know that's true of Walpole, which one of the clips mentioned here. Are all Massachusetts prisons that bad, or have there been improvements in them in more recent years?
It's a mix. Walpole is a very old facility. MCI Norfolk, the prison I was teaching in a lot, that was built in the 1920s. They built a new maximum security prison, Sousa Baranowski, that's about 15 years old. A lot of technology is being used to keep things locked down pretty tight in that prison. Some of the pre-release centres and minimums are newer. So it's a mix, but you're right that there are some very old and decrepit prisons there. The physical plant of some of the prisons that date from, built in the 50s and 60s is pretty poor.
First, thank you for a very interesting and impressive talk.
Well, come on, get on.
Switch is on. Are we down to one mic?
So, I was just wondering whether there were differences in the reentry experience. Were there differences in the reentry experience that you can tie? Can you find positives where people who were away for a shorter period of time, let's say less than 2 years, was that easier? Were people who had committed different crimes found it easier? Or people who had more schooling, was that easier? I mean, are there any lessons that are positive?
Yeah. There are some real success stories in the study, and I really appreciate that question, actually. Massachusetts, was the original Medicaid expansion state, and we had Romney Care and Mass Health, they call the Medicaid program in Massachusetts. Nearly everyone in Massachusetts state prison gets enrolled before they're released, and so Medicaid coverage in our sample was about 95%, and so there was quite reasonable continuity of care, and it was probably more true of physical conditions and mental health conditions. I think there's probably a treatment gap for mental health problems. But people were covered. And I was saying to Lonnie before we started, we have another study in Oklahoma City at the moment now, not a Medicaid expansion state. A very similar group of people, very poor, high rates of homelessness, a lot of untreated substance use disorders and so on. No one has any sort of medical coverage in Oklahoma that we're interviewing in our RCT of 600 people. And things are very tough. So that made a very strong positive difference. A very small group of people in the Boston sample got skilled jobs, union jobs in construction after release, about 8 people out of 122. All of them were older white men, and they were making $40, $50 an hour in the first months after incarceration, and that was really the only group that was significantly out of poverty in the year after release. The big risk factors for return to custody, about a third of our sample returned to custody in the 1 year follow-up period. 3 big risk factors were relapse to addiction, and that worked in a lot of different ways. It was failing drug tests, it was committing new crimes. Relapse to addiction, being young. There was a high rate of return to custody among younger people in our sample, and often, they were still embedded in peer networks that were still pretty actively involved in crime. And then the final thing was community supervision, being on parole or probation supervision. Net of your criminal involvement, being under community supervision was a risk factor for returning to custody, and people were going back on parole detainers and so on for violating the technical conditions of their supervision. And that often involved some sort of police contact that never rose to the level of a new criminal charge, but the nature of the contact amounted to a violation of the technical conditions of supervision.
I think I'm next, yeah. Okay. So I was curious if you could just talk a little bit about a lot of the things that you talked about in the study are things that were present prior to incarceration. So for example, you talked about childhood trauma, you talked about previous drug abuse, lots of things that clearly were there prior to incarceration. So I was wondering if you could just talk about, and I don't know if it's that we should dedicate resources to one area or less, but so is this a story about reentry, or is this a story about things we need to be doing prior to people even get to prison, right? And so could you just talk a little bit about that, if you're just thinking from resource allocation perspective, from just thinking about where is the root cause and where should we sort of be focusing our attention? Could you just talk a little bit about that? Because a lot of right, so a lot of this isn't, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a deep and complex question. I struggle with this a lot, and so by the time people arrive at state prison, they've been exposed to a lot of material hardship. As we learned in the reentry study, a lot of trauma. they've been institutionalised a lot already. Even if they're going to state prison for the first time, they've been to adult jail in most cases. In a lot of cases, they've been detained as kids. So I think one of the messages is that when we think about people who were very deeply disadvantaged, and when we think about people who are very deeply disadvantaged, what does that mean? Is it chiefly a shortage of income? And I think one of the implications is no, that it's not. That this very deep disadvantage is a clustering together of a whole array of adversities that partly involve serious health problems, life histories of trauma, as well as things that we more readily recognise as problems associated with poverty. Joblessness, very low income, housing insecurity. So I think one of the implications is we need a much richer idea, a much more multidimensional idea of what this deep disadvantage is. The policy implication, I think, is that our policy response has to be calibrated in kind. I think income transfers will probably only take us so far, right? If we're dealing with disadvantage on this scale, exposure to trauma. So we would ask people, did you grow up in a house where a family member was struggling with drug problems? And a lot of people would say yes. And then our follow-up question was, did you get any help or support with that? And there was none. And so I think we need to be thinking in a much more robust way about how to meet the challenge of this very multidimensional kind of poverty. I think there's a life course, there's a strong life course dimension to this, and we need to be thinking about what off-ramps would look like. I'm not comfortable with an overwhelming focus on the early child, for example. I think there are critical developmental processes that are happening in adolescence that we have to be focused on. I think a lot of this is very multi-generational. I know a lot of sort of the best practice in early child intervention is thinking about the entire family and not just the children themselves. I think we have to take that perspective into adolescence. We have to realise that people coming out of prison are themselves parents of children with an influence on the well-being of children, and they themselves are children, and their adult family members, their parents in many cases are taking care of them. This was the chief source of family support for our respondents, was the older women in their lives, the mothers and the grandmothers and the older sisters and the aunts. They need to be targets for policy support. So I think the overarching policy message is, it's hard, but I think we are seduced by the promise of magic bullets and maximising bang for buck. And I think we've created a situation, we've so disinvested over decades and decades, over generations and generations, that won't provide any answer. There will not be an early child intervention. There will not be a CBT. There will not be a reentry program. that's going to turn everything around. And a genuine anti-poverty program is going to be multi-generational, and it'll deal with the multiplex disadvantage that's associated with the unusually, weirdly harsh conditions of American poverty.
Aside from the risk of revocation, which you mentioned earlier, the risk of reconfinement, did you see any differences between the population under community supervision and those who had maxed out, either good or bad?
Supervision was a recidivism trap. POs in Massachusetts, like in most jurisdictions, had caseloads of around 80 or 100. And so there was very little help coming from that government agency. For people who were maxed out, and sometimes people were at a point in their sentence where they could complete their sentence or in 6 months, a year, or they could go up to the parole board in the meantime. And certainly we knew of people in the study who elected to max out rather than go on conditional release, and rather take the extra 6 months or a year or 18 months of incarceration. And I think that is telling us a lot about what community supervision is offering people who come out of prison. But that was really the main community supervision story. And the probation chair and Massachusetts probation is not a terrible agency. Ed Dolan, he really wants to help people, and but he has no resources to do so. If it was the way one parole officer explained it to me, say you knew someone coming out of prison, and your job was to get them back on their feet and help them get their lives back together after being in prison. How much time would that take? Would that take an hour a week? Would it take all week? Would it take 35 hours, 9 to 5? Would it take 70 hours? I think that is the challenge. I think community corrections is profoundly broken, actually, and if there's a case for abolition, maybe it's with community corrections.
So, Bruce, I just wanted you to clarify community corrections. So basically what you're saying is people would rather stay in prison or jail longer than get out and be on community corrections.
Be on probation or parole, correct.
Going back to reentry programs, my sense of that literature recently surveyed by Jen Doliak, but I think her conclusion was not a new one in that literature, that the margin isn't, will they solve all our problems? The margin is there any detectable effect whatsoever? Did any of the folks in your survey receive any services, whether while in prison or in the period that you were interviewing them, that seemed to, in a qualitative sense, improve their prison to work or prison to success transition?
As a result of programs?
Yeah.
Boston is not a program-rich environment, so this is what I think about that. I think there's a compelling case for strong investments in reentry policy, and it's got to have 3 pillars: housing, income support, and health. There is a deep, deep human need on all of those areas. If you make investments in income support, housing, and health, Will you reduce recidivism? Will you increase employment? I don't know. I don't think that's the right policy question. I think we've gotten ourselves in a box where we're expecting a minimum wage jobs program to turn someone's life around after being institutionalised for 5 years. How much money would we have to spend to turn someone's life around to get them stably employed after they've been institutionalised for 5 years? So we're dramatically underdosed with these programs. That's why, in my view, they don't work, in a sense. I am very uncomfortable with the idea that recidivism should be our yardstick of success. I think we should be thinking about public policy as promoting social integration. How can people become members of their communities again after they've been forcibly separated from them for so long? So I would say, what's much in the way that Bob Lampman would write. What's the poverty reduction effect of an income transfer program for people coming out of prison? That I think is a really important policy question in a population whose median income is $6,000 in the year after incarceration.
My question is similar. I'm wondering if at your baseline interviews, if you found any information about the sort of reentry planning that was taking place within the institution, how were these individuals being prepared for community life, and did that change their outcomes?
There is discharge planning, and Department of Correction has. There are two kinds of staff inside a prison. There's custody staff, which are the correctional officers, and there's program staff, and there's in all the Massachusetts prisons there are people who are specifically charged with the responsibility of discharge planning, smoothing the release. A lot of it was very sensible. You cannot release to street homelessness in Massachusetts, and so they spent a lot of time trying to organise housing on the outside. Affordable housing is very tough in Boston. It's an expensive housing market, and so a lot of that work went into that. There was a lot of participation in prison programs. I think prisons are very lousy environments for building sort of pro-social skills and making behavioural change and so on. Those programs don't evaluate very well, and at some level, it's not at all surprising. I think, and I can, there's an anecdote. I think one thing we can really positively do in prison is build literacy and basic education, and I think that is really important. And it's definitely the case that people who have access to higher education in prison say that that turned things around for them. Though again, even with higher education programs, the evaluation literature is mixed. But I think being able to read is a contribution to one's civic membership, and we should do that because being able to read is important in modern society, regardless of its effects on recidivism or employment or something like that.
This actually builds off of what you just said. I know you said that you're a little bit reticent to accept childhood interventions, but one thing that stuck out with me was the gap with education levels and incarceration rates. So do you see that as maybe something? And then also how so much of the discourse around education is focused on economic development, job attainment versus very much what you just talked about, just basic skill sets, literacy, things like that for life skills that might have fantastic public policy interventions like reducing incarceration rates.
Yeah, and I should be clear with respect to early child interventions. My only concern is that if it were to crowd out other interventions at other points in the life course, if we became so focused on that as that's where the bang for buck is, that it crowds out other kinds of social investments. It's interesting with education. I do think there's some exogenous causal component in educational attainment that affects one's risk of incarceration, and nearly everyone that we interviewed had very, very checkered histories at school. Many people stopped going to school, well before 10th grade even, and they were nominally enrolled, but they just weren't regularly attending school. I think a lot of people probably had undiagnosed learning disabilities. Their schools weren't equipped. They were often manifest as behavioural problems, and schools would often respond with out-of-school suspension and so on, which I think puts young people massively at risk of contact with police. And so school is partly providing education, building human capital. It's partly providing a source of structure and adult guardianship in the lives of kids. And I think the link between school failure and incarceration is as much about that loss of adult guardianship as it is about some deficit of human capital. Is that responsive?
So you started out the talk looking at these historic rises in incarceration and how we're an outlier across nations, and then you talked about the relatively flat crime rate. And then you talked about the potential for policy solutions, and we have been talking about solutions or the implications of the data you've just collected for kind of programming things, but what about the meta question? What happens when you tell the first part of your story, and what you found when you worked with the National Science Foundation was the not to incarcerate to the levels that we do as the policy intervention. And even in the clips that you showed, that man talked about the violence he experienced while in prison, regardless of how he came to be there. So that's an intervention that we're doing on the negative side. So I wonder if we could talk about the first part and how to think about that. How does one do that? How does one decarcerate?
I think it was. I felt for so much of my career working on this problem. Right, things got worse every year. Every year, the incarceration rate went up, like through the 90s, through the early 2000s. Things just got worse and worse. And then something began to change. I think the financial crisis in 2008 was pivotal. And incarceration rates began to tick down, and the policy conversation began to change. And the punitiveness that we'd embraced with such energy and enthusiasm, this has started to dissipate. So decarceration is beginning to happen unevenly, and the policy conversation is beginning to change. It's a very, very open question, what the next 10 or 15 years are going to look like, whether the declines are going to be sustained. I think as a technical matter, we know exactly what has to be done, and it's largely about sentencing reform. And I think at this point, it's largely about sentences for violent offences, and particularly reducing very long sentences for violent offences. I think a new policy consensus, public consensus, is emerging around drug policy, and the social costs of of drug addiction in the context of the opioid crisis. Marijuana legalization is, with a burgeoning transformation in how we think as a country about marijuana as a drug, and that's really positive. And now the really hard political question is, how are we going to respond to violence? Are we going to continue to pile on these really long sentences, 10-year, 20-year sentences that at the core of these really high rates of incarceration? You listen to the Democratic candidates, for example. Everyone is talking about criminal justice reform on the stump. Mostly they're very careful to confine their leniency, their compassion, their mercy to non-violent drug offenders. Until we're able to change that narrative around the social problem of violence and begin to talk about it in a much more compassionate way, I think this policy challenge of these very long sentences will remain. And I have to say, so the book is very much motivated by that problem, to try and squarely confront the social reality of violence, but talk about it in a way that can try and be compassionate to people who are drawn into it.
This is just a quick question. I was wondering what your attrition rate ended up being.
We completed 94% of all scheduled interviews, and we completed 91% of our final exit interviews. Now, a few of them were pretty late, but we nearly got everyone, and I think we're able to see. It turns out that socioeconomic insecurity is a massive mechanism for non-response in the survey, and we see that not so much in the non-response rate, but the delay in whether or not we're interviewing people in time, and socioeconomic insecurity is highly predictive of a late interview, which I believe in other kinds of studies, those kinds of study respondents will lost to follow-up.
So we are perfectly on time, so please join us for a reception. Let's throw on the floor.
Thank you so much.